Right, good morning. I'm assuming that the microphones work and I don't need the roving mic. Everyone can hear me at the back there? Yeah. Okay, so my name's Mark Pallen. Now, this lecture is a little bit, I'm almost a fraud here, in that I'm actually a bacteriologist, but I'm going to teach you about human genome evolution. I know a lot about bacterial genome evolution, and I'm sort of moonlighting giving this lecture. But it's a lecture I've given for over 10 years now, and I think I'm on top of the literature, and I hope I can persuade you, actually, it is one of the most exciting areas of science currently as we go forward. So let's start with a story, and we'll start our story with a place. So Neanderthal is the name in German for a valley about half an hour's drive out of Düsseldorf in Germany. And it's named after a 17th century pastor named Joachim Neumann, and for some reason back in those days they considered it a very fancy thing to do to, instead of calling his name means Newman, they just translated it into Greek. So Neander is just Greek for Newman. And so it was called Neanderthal. And in the old German spelling, there was an H in the Tal. And then they had this spelling reform in 1901. But unfortunately, the term Neanderthal with the H got fixed in the scientific literature. And that's still used in the taxonomic nomenclature. And in fact, what you find now, it's very, very annoying, is if you look in Science, which is an American journal, they take the H out. If you look at Nature, which is a UK, British English journal, they keep the H in. So it's kind of, if you want to do PubMed searches, you have to put Neanderthal with the H and without the H, and put a big or between them. Anyway, what about this valley? So there are numerous caves and rock shelters along this valley. There was one that was called the Kleine Feldhofgrotte, and in the 1850s, because of the growth of industry in the Ruhr Valley, lots of limestone quarrying was going on, so they could provide enough limestone for coke and iron manufacture. And this company here, the firm Beckersloff and Pieper, they started knocking down the valley walls and excavating these caves. And as this was going on, in August 1856, they discovered a skull cap and 15 postcranial bones from this particular cave, this grotto. Now, when it was first picked up, it was thought, oh, it's a kind of cave bear, so it doesn't really matter. But it was shown to this local teacher, who was a natural historian called Fulrott, and he said, no, that these are human. They're kind of human anyway. Human, but not as we know it. And it was written up as a paper by him and one of his associates the following year in 1857. So it was described as an archaic form of humans. And one of the great stories that I've come across in the scientific literature in recent years is this one, which is that actually where it was found was destroyed because they excavated all the cave walls and they couldn't quite work out where the original specimens were found. But a group around the turn of the century said, well, why don't we go back and see if we can find more samples from that same site? And they tried to work out where the site was. What they did was they looked at 200-year-old lithographs that showed the various landmarks around, and tried using all this kind of information. They worked out where they thought the original excavations took place. And they went back and started digging. And they found more Neanderthal bones, which is quite remarkable. So like 150 years later, they went back to the same site, found more Neanderthal bones. But what was actually more exciting still was that they actually found a bone, a vertebra, bone that actually fitted into the original type specimen like pieces of a jigsaw. So it was part of the same bone, two fragments from the same bone, one excavated 150 or so years after the other one. So it's quite a remarkable story. So this is what it used to look like back in the days, a bit like kind of Cheddar Gorge back 150 years ago. This is what it was like about 5 years ago when I went there, and basically all of the surrounding steep inclines have all been removed, and it's all very flat around the valley itself. And these little stakes there that you can see in the middle of this field, that's where the subsequent excavations took place. And what they think is that the cave was probably where there's a steep bank to one side there, a little bit of an escarpment, and that's perhaps where the original cave was, and basically material had fallen down into this flat area. But it wasn't this kind of human wasn't restricted to just the Neander Valley. In fact, there have been over 400 specimens found in the intervening century and a half. Many of them very complete, skulls, postcranial material, all sorts. And the geographical range actually turned out to be really quite extensive, in covering most of Europe, certainly the southern parts of Europe. Obviously, at a certain stage, the northern parts of Europe were covered by ice sheets, but in the parts that weren't, basically there are specimens found there, specimens found in Asia, and even as far away as Siberia. So an extremely wide range of this particular Neanderthal man, as the name went. And when people tried to look at what kind of human was this, they started off here. This is a reconstruction that was made 100 years ago or more. Statues outside the museum in the Neander Valley, and the idea was that Neanderthals were some kind of brutish cavemen, primitive individuals. More recently, our assessment has turned to say, well, actually, no, they were just like us in many ways. They were actually quite sophisticated, and they're much more sympathetic reconstructions. This particular Neanderthal girl that's been reconstructed, I think, very sympathetic, with a kind of cheeky smile there. And so we're actually, people's view of what Neanderthals were has changed quite dramatically over that time. And it's said that if you put a Neanderthal in a suit and made him walk down the street, nobody would bat an eyelid. And so in the museum, they've actually done that. They've reconstructed a Neanderthal here and put him in a suit, and you probably wouldn't look twice. And if you want to take an age-matched, anatomically modern human for comparison, yeah, there isn't that much difference between them and us, is there really? And so we actually now have this rehabilitation of Neanderthals as sophisticated kind of cousin lineage, if you like, or sibling lineage to modern humans. So when did the Neanderthals live? Well, the first proto-Neanderthal features were recognised in skeletons from about 350,000 years ago, but the full-blown Neanderthal probably ranged from about 130,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago. There's some controversy about quite when they died out in Europe and how long they survived, but something of that measure. Sort of died out in Asia by about 50,000 and probably survived about 40,000 years ago in Europe. And that means that they overlapped in time and range with anatomically modern humans in Europe for at least 5,000 years. Now, although Neanderthals have this very wide range, one thing that is clear is that at the moment, at least, there's never been evidence of Neanderthal samples and anatomically modern human samples coming from the same site, at the, dated to the same time. So they appear to have different populations and lived apart, as far as we can ascertain from the evidence we have, of course, which is obviously very incomplete. Now, Neanderthals were anatomically distinct from anatomically modern humans, and it's said that if you tot up all the differences in skeletal morphology and anatomy more generally, these are bigger than, say, the difference between a common chimp and a bonobo. These Neanderthals are much more robust than anatomically modern humans, stockier, barrel-shaped chest, pronounced brow ridge, projecting mid-face, this low, flat, elongated skull, and at the back there's a sort of a bun at the back of the occipital region, which is quite distinctive, and they lacked the same kind of chins that we have as modern humans. In fact, the average brain size, though, of Neanderthals might be slightly larger than that of anatomically modern humans. So again, this is one of those factoids that undermines the idea that these are primitive, a kind of primitive branch of humanity. And in fact, there is not so much evidence for that. But the big question is, well, what happened to them? They kind of died out, but did they ever interbreed with anatomically modern humans? Now, maybe I should have put in a few more slides about this, but the current thinking that has been dominant now for 30, 40 years is that anatomically modern humans evolved in Africa and left Africa relatively recently, around 70,000 years ago. So that everyone that lives outside of Africa or has their native roots outside of Africa is descended from a small band of individuals who left and populated Eurasia and then the New World. And the question is, did Neanderthals actually have any genetic exchange with those individuals? And it's worth saying here, that just to make clear, is also that no Neanderthal samples have ever been found in Africa. So Neanderthals appear to be a Eurasian species or subspecies. So this is one way of putting it in a rather clinical way. If we want to be a little bit dirtier in the way we think about these things, the question is, did anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals ever have sex? So here's a kind of Neanderthal equivalent of Shakira asking the question. And, you know, what happened? Did it happen? So in 1997, we got the first Neanderthal DNA sequences. And this was the birth of this discipline of ancient DNA studies. And one of the founding fathers, like the godfather of this whole discipline, is a guy called Svante Pääbo. And he was the last author on this paper in Cell in 1997. And what they did was that they took those Neanderthal type specimens, the ones that I mentioned that actually came from the Neander Valley, and they extracted DNA and they amplified part of the mitochondrial genome sequence from from those samples and sequenced it. And when they looked at the sequences they obtained, and they then drew a phylogenetic tree, taking into account all the at that time known mitochondrial DNA variation in anatomically modern humans, what they found was that Neanderthals sat outside that variation, that range of variation that you see in anatomically modern humans. So what they said was that is like what we kind of agreed from the anatomical observations, that this is a different kind of human. It's a different species. They are different from us in a very fundamental way, if you like. They've gone off in a different direction, and all modern humans are much more closely related to each other than any of them are to Neanderthals. Now that was the conclusion that came out of those mitochondrial DNA studies. Now, of course, the mitochondrial genome is a funny little thing. It's a very small genome. It's transmitted down the maternal line only, and it is only a small fraction of a % of the entire human genome, which includes all of the so-called nuclear genome as well. And so you could say, is this a safe conclusion? Around that time, though, people started saying, well, even if they didn't interbreed with us, maybe we can start reconstructing their biology by looking at ancient DNA sequences. And people started doing various PCR tests to get Neanderthal sequences out of Neanderthal bones. And here are some of the early papers that came out of that. So a paper suggesting that this melanocortin receptor allele, the MC1R gene, which regulates pigmentation in modern humans, appeared to be slightly different in Neanderthals and probably associated with kind of freckled skin and reddish hair kind of phenotype is what was concluded there. People looked at other kinds of things that vary in modern humans, like the ABO blood group, and they could reconstruct what blood group that certain Neanderthals had. Bitter taste perception is one of these things that's one of those alleles that if you go and do 23andMe, it will tell you which way you are, and they could make conclusions about that. And there's a particular gene called FOXP2, and there's a whole other lecture on the differences between humans and our closest relative, chimpanzees and other primates, and FOXP2 in those analyses has been fingered as something that appears to have evolved more quickly in the human lineage and may be associated with our ability to speak. And the variant that was seen in modern humans actually turns out also to be found in Neanderthals, which kind of raises this intriguing question about, well, maybe Neanderthals had language as well. They also had a hyoid bone that suggested that they were similar to us in this regard, and perhaps that might be true. Now, I started giving these talks just over 10 years ago, and the second year I gave the talk. First year I gave the talk, that was it. Mitochondria tell us, no interbreeding, they're a separate species. And then in 2010, we got this draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. So again, Svante Pääbo coming in there as the last author, but David Reich, an American, joined the team, Janet Kelso, South African, and they managed to get DNA from various Neanderthal sites, and they were able to look at the variation in the divergence from the human reference genome of Neanderthals versus modern genomes. And you can see here that all the modern different representatives of different lineages, French, Han Chinese, Papuans, Yorubans as representatives of West Africans, and the San, they all cluster over here with a small amount of divergence, but Neanderthals, these three genomes that they had, turn out to have much greater divergence, which is kind of what you'd expect, really. You'd expect them, as we saw from the mitochondrial sequences, to sit outside the variation we see in modern humans. But the key question is, well, yeah, but are there some modern humans that are more closely related to Neanderthals, or vice versa? Are Neanderthals more closely related to some anatomically modern humans than others? And that would get to this question of, could there have been genetic exchange? So what they did was they compared the sites from the derived SNPs in Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, and they made a comparison to two genomes from European Americans. I think one of them was Craig Venter's genome, two East Asians, so Han Chinese, I think, and four West Africans. And what they found was that on average, Neanderthals were significantly closer to the non-African genomes. And so they then did much more deep comparisons, and they confirmed that Europeans and Asians are much closer, significantly closer than Africans to Neanderthals. And they were able to, by various reconstructions of these differences, show that the direction of flow was probably from Neanderthals to non-African humans. Now, this was quite a surprise. What people had thought up till then was that there were some people who belonged to this so-called multi-regionalist theory that maybe there had been interbreeding, but it was assumed, well, it would have been with Europeans, because that's where they overlap primarily. But it turned out it wasn't just Europeans, it was all non-Africans, so Europeans and Asians. And so, and it was said that there were segments in Craig Venter's genome that were more Neanderthal than they were African. And in these early studies, they said something like 1 to 4% of the non-African genome is Neanderthal. So, we now have an answer. Yes, there must have been sex between Neanderthals and some non-African humans. And there's a track, and there's actually a video on YouTube that came out, I think, in the 1980s from a group, or 70s even, from a group called Hot Legs, called Neanderthal Man, where they talk about Neanderthal sex in the Neanderthal world. Obviously, they were rather prescient. If you watch the video, it's completely non-politically correct nowadays, but it seems that Hot Legs, this pop group, were correct in predicting that humans and Neanderthals had sex in the past. And this rough tree here shows you basically what we think about the divergence of various lineages among modern humans. So anatomically modern humans, the earliest branch was the San, the Bushman from South Africa, Southern Africa and Southwest Africa. Then if you look at other African lineages diverged after that, West Africans, and then Papuans, Chinese and Europeans diverged after the out of Africa migration. And Neanderthals, that interbreeding must have occurred, therefore, sometime shortly after anatomically modern humans left Africa. So before they went off into East Asia, before they went far up into Europe, sometime around then. So I've done my 23andMe, and 23andMe tells you how much of your genome is Neanderthal, and I turn out to be a little bit more Neanderthal, so that comparison we did earlier, perhaps it wasn't misplaced. I'm 2.8% Neanderthal, puts me in the 58th percentile for Neanderthal ancestry. Average 23andMe users 2.7%. And my daughter is 2.7%. She's on the average. Is there anyone awake enough to realise why my daughter might have less Neanderthal ancestry than me? Well, it turns out, if you believe 23andMe, that my daughter actually has some African ancestry. A very small amount, I think about 0.1%. But, and probably, what we know of the history of our country, probably the result of liaison between a slave and a slave owner at some stage in the last 400 years. But that may account for the difference. In fact, she's got a bit less Neanderthal, I've got a bit more Neanderthal than her. But you can see the average Japanese person 2.7, the average Chinese person 2.5, and then average Nigerian person 0.3% is what it's saying there. And that 0.3% is probably because there's a little bit of European admixture into some Nigerians. Now, that, 2010, 2011, that was all pretty mind-blowing. The idea that we could ever get the Neanderthal genome sequences out and start making comparisons and make inferences was mind-blowing. But then we get something else that's even more mind-blowing. It didn't come from a skull, like here with the Hamlet. It came from a finger bone, a little finger bone. This little finger bone was discovered in a cave in Siberia. DNA was extracted and sequenced, and they reconstructed the mitochondrial DNA genome from that finger bone, and they said, this is different from modern humans, but it's also different from Neanderthals. And it looks like it's another lineage of archaic humans that diverged as divergent from modern humans as the Neanderthals are. And this, they called it, because it was found in a cave called the Denisova cave, they called this this lineage the Denisovans. And I spoke to Janet Kelso, I met her in South Africa, and she said that they made a deliberate choice. They weren't going to give it a species name and call it Homo denisovanensis or something like that, because they didn't want to get embroiled in arguments about what's a species, what's a subspecies, or whatever. So this lineage has just been called the Denisovans, alongside the Neanderthals, as a kind of not quite a proper taxonomic name, but used as a common name for this. So this, is kind of mad. So 62 there is where the cave is, right, pretty much in the middle, the right middle point of the Eurasian landmass in Siberia. And when you look at the mitochondrial sequences here, you can see all this variation in anatomically modern humans. And if you look carefully, you can see that first branch there, that's all African. And then the second clade is all African. The third, this larger clade here, you've got a mixture of African and non-African modern mitochondrial sequences. There's all that variation. There's the Neanderthal variation, which in mitochondria, even though we now have several different mitochondrial genomes from Neanderthals showing variation within the Neanderthals, that variation in Neanderthals still sits outside the anatomically modern humans, but the Denisovans are actually even further out here as a separate branch. Now, I know Alice Roberts quite well, and we gave a joint talk once in Birmingham and talking about this kind of stuff, and she was extremely dismissive. Oh, it's just a bloody genome from a finger bone, And I said, well, maybe it's just a silly finger bone to you, but it is a whole genome, and it has as the standing in evidence is stronger, if you like. Millions of data points in that genome compared to what you get when you just look at fossil bones. So that's just a little put down on her. And genomes really have changed our thinking about this in a dramatic way. So this whole field never stops, never stays where it is, always moves forward. And so shortly after, a year or two after the discovery of the reconstruction of that mitochondrial genome, they actually got an initial nuclear genome at 1.9-fold coverage, and then they got a 30x genome sequence from a Denisovan individual. And these observations confirmed what had been concluded originally from the mitochondrial genomes, which is that this lineage is indeed a separate lineage as distinct from modern humans as Neanderthals. Or at least it appears that the branch that led to the Denisovans and Neanderthals did branch off early from modern humans, and that they are just slightly more closely related to each other than they are to modern humans, but not by much. So these are deep branches in the human phylogeny. And then the shock that was discovered once that genome had been unravelled, the nuclear genome, same kind of stories we saw in the Neanderthals. Okay, the mitochondrial sequences tell you one thing and seem to give you what you think is a very clear picture. Oh yeah, they're quite different. When they got the nuclear genome, they discovered that certain ethnic groups, particularly Melanesians, including Australian Aborigines, people from Papua New Guinea, had Denisovan ancestry. And again, a few percent, not massive, but a few percent, but absolutely decisively there, no question about this. And so it's clear that there wasn't just one of these archaic introgressions into modern human lineages, there were at least two, because the Denisovans gave some of their DNA to this branch leading to the Papuans and other Melanesians. And a little while later, this paper, again, each paper just like This is one of those areas where you just get knocked off your chair completely, repeatedly, because like, what, really? They actually found some stuff from this Denisovan cave that showed that one of the individuals there had a Denisovan, which way around was it? A Denisovan father and a Neanderthal mother. So evidence, direct evidence of interbreeding between these two different archaic lineages. So obviously they must have stayed separate for long enough and diverge as much as they did, but then later on, as with these archaic lineages exchanging DNA with modern humans, they also exchanged DNA with each other, and this individual was the example. And as time has gone on, this initial easy story, simple story of Neanderthals gave DNA to modern humans and Denisovans gave DNA to modern humans has become more tangled. So this individual called, they nicknamed him Denny, is just one example of this interbreeding. And we now accept that there was perhaps another mystery hominin species that or lineage, which perhaps accounted for some of the Denisovan genome that interbred with them. We accept that there is this interbreeding with some Asians, and particularly Melanesians. But we do accept that there have been probably more than one, certainly more than one exchange of DNA, even between Neanderthals and modern humans and Denisovans and modern humans. So this is a paper just from earlier this year, where looking at Papuans, they reconstructed the Denisovan contribution to their genomes and said it looks as if there must have been multiple episodes, at least 3 episodes of genetic exchange to account for what we see. And similarly, earlier this year, a paper in Nature Ecology and Evolution saying, well, actually, we can see that there's evidence from multiple episodes of interbreeding. So it wasn't just a one-off. This happened on multiple occasions in the past. Now, you look at different groups of humans around today, they interbreed. You'll find someone who's half Chinese and half Maori if you look hard enough. Every population is interbreeding to some small degree. So in a sense, it's perhaps not surprising. But we used to have these very fixed views about lineages going off and being different. It's clear that it's not quite that straightforward. Now that brings us to an interesting point. So anatomically modern humans came out of Africa. We think the most likely thing is that they came out of the part of Africa that abuts the Arabian Peninsula. In this particular picture here, it looks as if they crossed through the Sinai. There is the other option is that they went across the bottom here down the Horn of Africa, but somehow they managed to get into West Asia and then spread from there into Europe and into Asia more generally, and then obviously eventually into the New World tens of thousands of years later. And they came into contact with Neanderthals and Denisovans during that time. And what this means is if we look at modern human genomes and we look at the landscape of those genomes and we look at lots of individuals, what we can do is we can actually fish out the Neanderthal components. But here's a quick quote, is that average length of introgress haplotypes about 57 kilobases, and about a quarter of all protein coding genes have one or more exons that overlap the Neanderthal sequence. So if you look hard enough, you'll find this stuff. So although from the ancient DNA studies, we just get a handful of these Neanderthal genomes, if we look at all of us non-Africans, it's reckoned that there's probably about a 20% of a Neanderthal genome that can be recovered from these individuals. over time. Now, each of us only can, any of it you saw with me is only just over 2%, small amount of Neanderthal sequence, but cumulatively, this actually amounts to a substantial amount of the Neanderthal genome persisting in the modern human population. So there's been a lot of interest in what happened to the Neanderthals, why did they die out? Another argument is they didn't die out, they just interbred with a larger population, and there's more Neanderthal sequences on this planet today than there ever have been because of the massive expansion since then. But not all Neanderthal sequences behaved equally. So some Neanderthal sequences, when they came into the anatomically modern human genetic background, appeared to be deleterious. And it may be that they didn't interact in a good way with an existing variant encoded elsewhere in the genome. And there clearly are these fitness costs to hybridization that many of those incoming sequences are got rid of quite quickly. So if you look at the X chromosome, for example, we find that there's 5-fold less Neanderthal ancestry there than in the autosomes. And that may be because there was reduced fitness or even sterility in the male hybrid offspring, where they only had one copy of the X chromosome to use. And in fact, if you look carefully, you can see these kind of Neanderthal deserts in Eurasian genomes. These are regions where you just don't see any Neanderthal ancestry. So the largest one of these is a region of about 15 megabase pairs on chromosome 7. And this contains the gene FOXP2, and there are associations with autism. Last year when I said that genes could be associated with autism, someone gave me a load of grief saying that I was part of a genocidal movement to eradicate autistic people. That is not the case at all. There are genes associated with any kind of phenotype, and just because there are genes associated with them doesn't mean that investigating those genes means that one takes any political view whatsoever. Let's make that clear. And 2 of my children are on the autism spectrum, so I have a particular axe to grind in that area. So don't pick a fight with me on that one, please. Anyway, sorry, that's from last year. I'm sure nobody in this audience is going to be the same. But anyway, regions depleted of archaic lineages are significantly enriched for genes expressed in specific brain regions. And so this is kind of tantalizing. It suggests that maybe there are essential differences in the genetic background that account for some kind of essential differences in brain functioning in Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, and maybe that's why we colonized the whole world, whereas Neanderthals kind of didn't really. But there is also evidence that these things that coming in are not bad. Sometimes they are actually good and are selected for. And actually, there's this question about whether that hominin admixture from archaic hominins actually helped modern humans adapt to the out-of-Africa environments that they encountered in Europe and Asia. And if we look, we can look at, go along the chromosome and see how much Neanderthal is there in a particular region on average. And you can see that there are several loci that are actually enriched for Neanderthal genes, and these include immune-related genes and skin pigmentation genes. So this OCA2 gene encodes a transmembrane protein involved in iris, skin and hair pigmentation, and this appears to have come into Europeans, and it does seem to be associated with the blue versus brown eyes in Europeans. But the bit that actually came from Neanderthals doesn't seem to be a protein coding region. It appears to be a regulatory region. So we don't quite know what that means, but it's again, it's very tantalizing to suggest that some of the phenotypic variation and the phenotypic features that we see in these non-African populations of modern humans may have had their origins in Neanderthals. There are these other 3 genes, OAS1, 2, and 3, that encode antiviral proteins, And the Neanderthal haplotype there is different. It results in differential splicing and higher activity. And there's also, as part of this theme of immune regulation, fighting against infections, there's a TLR haplotype which has variants that are associated with various immune traits, and the Neanderthal haplotype appears to influence that, increasing TLR6 expression, specifically in certain immune cells. Another thing that's Neanderthals. Another area that's been looked at is what the Denisovans bring, and one eye-catching headline was this one here: that altitude adaptation in Tibetans is caused by introgression of this Denisovan-like DNA. So the ability to live at high altitude in environments where oxygen levels are low, there appears to be a particular hypoxic pathway gene that seems to have come into Tibetans from Denisovans, and may have accounted for their increased fitness in that environment. And it also has been shown now that if you look in parts of West Asia, that you can see where there's admixture into modern Eurasians of Denisovan genes, that we may have acquired some of the HLA alleles from this source as well. And so this has really become a very hot topic over recent years. And yeah, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, would there really be people studying the medical consequences of admixture from Neanderthals into modern humans, I'd have said, don't be silly, you just can't do that. But this is what people are doing. There's a group here, they looked at common Neanderthal variants in over 1,000 electronic health records, over 28,000 adults of European, and they discovered and replicated associations of Neanderthals with neurological, psychiatric, immunological and dermatological phenotypes. So Neanderthal lesions, Neanderthal alleles explained a significant fraction of the variation risk for depression, skin lesions associated from sun exposure, and hypercoagulation and tobacco use. So this is not just it's now no longer just some kind of vague thing, oh, Neanderthals did something with humans sexually and whatever. It does appear that these had functional consequences. So here are just some of the SNPs that they looked at. So one of them associated with tobacco use disorder. So any of you still smoking and haven't been able to give up, you can blame it on your Neanderthal ancestry, perhaps. So this is, I'd say, more or less the same kind of thing. I've just read it out from the actual abstract, but these various traits here. Janet Kelso and one of her colleagues also wrote a similar kind of thing here, and they found 4 phenotypes. Again, they fingered the smoking status, various chronotypes, loneliness or isolation, frequency of unenthusiasm or disinterest in the last 2 weeks, which is, probably a common phenotype among students, and you can blame that again on your Neanderthal ancestry. And just in the last few months, as a paper came out where they've looked at copy number variants. So instead of most of the work in this field up till now has looked at SNPs, at single nucleotide polymorphism, but here's evidence that actually we have copy number variants that have been acquired from, this is in Melanesians, that have been acquired from Denisovans and Neanderthals, and showing that these have been positively selected for in these populations, and variants that are derived from these archaic hominins. And here's another paper where they looked at this issue of RNA viruses, and they looked at the variants that the DNA that had come in that helped modern humans adapt against viruses, and they showed that this was particularly focused on alleles that might help combat RNA viruses. And so what they're arguing here is that when anatomically modern humans came out of Africa and moved into the Eurasian continent, they would have come across diseases that they'd not yet encountered. And which perhaps Neanderthals had developed immunity to, and they gained immunity or improved immunity to that by interbreeding with the Neanderthals. So this is some way echoes we know during the colonial era, when Europeans went to the New World, they carried diseases with them to which the resident populations had no immunity. This is an example of a similar kind of phenomenon as humans perhaps left Africa. And again, this is a course on evolutionary medicine, and here's a paper where they give an evolutionary medicine perspective, and they're pointing out that there is a legacy of Neanderthals, but also they showed that Neanderthal genetic diversity was relatively low compared to modern humans. But they did actually have similar or higher levels of genetic diversity than humans in 12 MHC genes. So as it says here, they may have been relatively more susceptible to some novel pathogens, and differential pathogen resistance could be considered as a potential contributing factor to their extinction. So it may have been the other way around from what I just said, which is that actually modern humans coming out of Africa might have given diseases to Neanderthals that they were poorly able to deal with. There is obviously, you have to treat all of these observations, these conclusions at least, with a degree of skepticism. In evolutionary biology, we talk about the so-called just so story, which neatly kind of explains what's happened and provides a neat answer, but actually turns out to be very difficult to prove or specifically to falsify. So you have to be careful with this kind of stuff. But this whole field is really on a steep curve upwards in terms of amount of data, number of analyses, and so forth, and not yet in a mature state. But it's fascinating. Here's another paper that came out recently, a series of papers that came out recently looking at Denisovans, where they were able to make observations about Denisovan anatomy. So the problem has been that we have these finger bones, a tooth, and then their mandible have been recovered from Denisovans, but nothing else. So we have no idea about their skeletal anatomy. We have no idea about their cranial anatomy. And so a group in Israel, they actually went and looked at methylation patterns in using the DNA recovered from Denisovans, and came up with a portrait of what they thought a Denisovan looked like. And it's an interesting question. As we move forward over time in the coming years, probably someone will discover some Denisovan fossils, the more extensive fossils, and we'll be able to see whether they got this right or not. It would be very exciting if people did discover a full cranium. Now, this stuff keeps stretching your brain, kind of literally in a way, in the sense that this here is showing that Neanderthal-derived genetic variation drives modern human cranium and brain shape and variation. And this paper here, they said, well, is it that if you look at Europeans and you do MRI scanning and so forth, is any of the variation that you see in modern Europeans compared to Africans, let's say, derived from Neanderthals? Can we actually show that? And they were able to find a correlation between Neanderthal ancestry on certain alleles, Neanderthal, what they called a Neander score, a greater load of Neanderthal-derived genetic variants. They showed that this was associated with skull shapes resembling those of known cranial remains. So again, that rather fanciful thing where I compared myself to a Neanderthal, well, maybe there is something about the shape of my skull and brain, shape of most people in the room's skull and brain, that is actually related to our Neanderthal ancestry, which is kind of totally mad. And here, this is very cutting edge and kind of slightly unsettling, I suppose, that a group have actually taken one of the genes that was known to be involved in regulation of the development of the brain. They've taken the allele from Neanderthals and they put it into human cells. They've replaced the anatomically modern human variant, and then they have gone back. They've reversed the development of skin cells, turned them back into primordial stem cells, and then developed these brain organoids, and shown that the ones carrying the Neanderthal variant show a different phenotype. And you can see they look quite different. This is a slightly different crinkly shape to the Neanderthal ones compared to anatomically modern humans. And in fact, they made a little joke here. They take several months to grow the Neanderthal DNA containing stem cells into organoids. We call them Neanderoids. So there we are. It's a terrible pun. So these are the Neanderoids down here that look clearly different from, I guess we'd have to call them humanoids if we're calling these Neanderoids. And this is just the beginning, I think, of this whole line of work. So this line of work where you can find an allele from an archaic lineage. In fact, people are doing the same kind of thing with, say, chimpanzee alleles as well. You can individually swap them into a human lineage and do functional characterization of the cells, of the pathways, of gene expression. Obviously, we can't grow embryos that have Neanderthal characteristics, and in science fiction there's all this stuff about could we resurrect Neanderthals. Obviously that is beyond the pale in terms of ethics, but there is a huge amount that is going on in terms of trying to dissect out what are the important differences between us and Neanderthals and between all human lineages and our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. I'm nearly finished now. So this is this overlaps a bit with the next talk I'm going to give you next week, where they looked here at not reconstructing ancient genomes from Neanderthals, but looking at what ancient DNA could tell you about the diet and the microbial companions of Neanderthals. And so they had they've got evidence of the diet of woolly rhinoceros and sheep, and then in one environment in Belgium, in a cave in Spain, they got mushrooms, pine nuts and moss, and they were able to get evidence of a chronic gastrointestinal pathogen and this archaeal commensal Methanobrevibacter oralis, and they actually got like a 10x coverage of this genome from 48,000 years ago. So this is the oldest microbial genome that we have and reconstructed here from a Neanderthal, and you can see that it is related and clearly branches with the modern human variant of the same. Now, I've pretty much focused in this talk on archaic human lineages and what ancient DNA has been able to tell us about them, and also what modern studies have done. But there are some changes that have happened since our divergence from Neanderthals that are also clearly important. And here's one of them, the human amylase genes. So human amylase genes show adaptations where we've got, so as it says here, look at find notable depression of genetic diversity both in African and non-African populations. So this is evidence of a genetic sweep where certain alleles have taken over. So multiple secondary losses copy number with the highest frequency of deletion and associated in Siberian populations where they've been low in starch diet. But this is one of those hot areas in terms of certainly divergence from chimps, but also it appears that there's a selective sweep that, in amylase genes, allowing us to scavenge starch from our diet that prostates are split with Neanderthals. But as I say, excuse my bias towards archaic, there's actually in recent years now been an explosion of ancient genome sequencing from across the world, for humans from across, not so much in Africa, but in the New World and Old World, particularly focused in Europe. And we've got huge numbers of genomes now. So, as it said, this is a few years old, a couple of years old, over 800 genomes, ancient human genomes coming out of Europe. In fact, you may have seen in the news recently, about 3 weeks ago, there was a whole heap of several dozen ancient genomes came out of excavations in Rome, where they showed that in the Roman Empire, a lot of the population weren't natives of the Italian peninsula, but in fact were from the Eastern Mediterranean, which is perhaps not surprising. So there's just so much to cover here. In terms of medical information in these ancient genomes, one key area that has been documented is lactase persistence. So Eurasians, particularly Europeans, are able to digest lactose in the diet obtained from dairy produce. And this is because a gene which is active in early life persists into adult life, the lactase enzyme. And the genetic basis of it is known, and people have been able to look at the genomes that have been recovered in Europe and show that over time, starting around 5,000 years ago, the percentage of lactose persistence alleles increases in these populations. So this is actually documenting with clear molecular evidence one of the most rapidly evolving alleles, in fact, in modern human populations over time. And that's me finished. So in conclusion, anatomically modern humans, we know, shared the planet with archaic hominins during the relatively recent past, only tens of thousands of years ago. And we actually can reconstruct patterns of admixture so that these archaic hominins made genetic contributions to the gene pool of modern humans, and we have evidence of adaptation, that some of those alleles came in and had important biological effects, and some of it accounts for some of the modern patterns of disease. Now, this is a fast-moving field, and probably what we have to say next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, will be even richer. But it's been an amazing area. Even I've just given this lecture for 10 years. It's been fascinating to actually follow this literature and try and keep up with it. If you're interested, and I hope I've inspired you, I find this absolutely fascinating stuff. I put a couple of reviews up on Blackboard that you might want to look at, well, 3 reviews. If you're really interested and you want something to read over the Christmas holidays, there's a couple of good books. Svante Pääbo a few years ago did a book called Neanderthal Man, talking about his basically invention of ancient DNA studies as a field of research. And he tells you all sorts of funny things about his sexuality as well. It's quite a very personal sort of book. David Reich has written one more recently looking at not just Neanderthal and the archaic admixture, but also the population movements and what we can tell about population spread of anatomically modern humans as we've peopled the world, and that's fascinating as well. I've got some, I didn't tell you anything about the out of Africa hypothesis and stuff like that, and there's comparisons in chimpanzees. If you are interested, I've given lectures on those things in the past and thrown up the files onto my YouTube channel. I'll put this onto my YouTube channel as well. I've recorded a slide cast of this. And Alice Roberts, as I say, we had just a few ad lib comments about, it's just a finger bone, no, it's a whole genome. And then a few years after that, she was commissioned to do this documentary, a Horizon documentary on the lost tribes of humanity, where she provided all the rich evidence for the fact that there were these different kinds of humans, and I'll provide you with a link to that as well on the website. So that's me finished. Has anyone got any comments or questions? No? I know 9 o'clock lectures are not so great, are they? You're